Okay, so I want to go over the entire case of Julian Assange from the beginning. A lot of people right now, we've been this case has gone on for so long. Hopefully, there's an end in sight at some point, but it's been going on forever, and we get bits and pieces here and there whenever something new happens. But what I want to do today for the people that are not fully familiar with the Julian Assange case, they might know a little here and there, or they might even be somebody who's totally against Julian Assange, thinks he's the bad guy, or there's the people out there who they know that he's probably not the bad guy, but they don't fully know the whole entire story. So you're one of the most well researched people on this particular on this subject, Julian Assange. So if you wouldn't mind, can we start at the beginning? Let's start with when WikiLeaks began, if we can, and what it was that got Julian Assange in that put him on the radar in the very beginning.
You have to go back to 2006, 2007 when this idea is in Julian Assange's mind that he should start a site that is almost identical to Wikipedia. But it would be a site, and actually, the early form of WikiLeaks before they received the documents that we'll be discussing in this hour, it looked like a Wikipedia site. It was very crude in its form. And he imagined that this could be a location that whistleblowers around the world, people who were, as he put it, ethically defecting from their own governments, could send documents and then they would all be collected in one location. So you could have a massive archive basically from dissidents all over the world. And in fact, when WikiLeaks first imagined that they would do this work, it was focused on sub-Saharan Africa. It was focused on China, Russia, these countries that were known to be to have more dictators, like regimes that were
Right.
tyrannical and of that nature. I got my tongue tied, sorry, but the way that they developed this was to promote this idea of principled leaking and collect this information. And the first leak that was a big deal, it involved Kenya. And so it wasn't this organization that had any intentions to develop into the organization that was seemingly at war with the United States, or vice versa, where the United States was at war with WikiLeaks.
Mhm.
In the beginning, there was no reason why the US government would be concerned with WikiLeaks from an ideological standpoint, because there wasn't anything about it that they were seeking to expose of the US government that was unique to other news media organizations. They were virtually indistinguishable. And in fact, there was a 2008 intelligence report that was done by, I believe it was an Army Intelligence Center, and they concluded that WikiLeaks, had editorial procedures. They cared about the newsworthiness of information. They were posting things on their website that had information about military equipment and other documents. And there were things that were trickling out and making it their way to the WikiLeaks website, but none were the kinds of disclosures that we're going to talk about here, which is why Julian Assange has been prosecuted. But I think that's a good setup for just letting people know that that was the frame of mind of Julian Assange. And it was this concept of scientific journalism that is sometimes spoken about by people who understand WikiLeaks. The idea being that, for the most part, when you go to read a major story, uh, if documents form the basis for that news reporting, usually the editors of that publication don't share that material with you. Or up until 2010, they did not share that material with you. Julian Assange said, well, in order to trust and recognize that that information is true and authentic, why don't we make those documents available? And then the public, if they doubt the story, they'll have that document so that they can say, oh, well, I guess it really is true that is happening, that intelligence
Mhm.
agency is engaged in those actions, that military is engaged in those actions, and then go from there as far as an informed public making the decisions that they would like to make based on the information.
It always drives me crazy whenever I read an article from one of these major mainstream news outlets where they get their hands on some classified documents and they just describe what's in them to us. And I'm like, I'm supposed to trust you? You know, so many of them are no longer trustworthy. So, that puts us in a, like with the Jack Teixeira document leaks. Um, we're supposed to trust the mainstream media that ended up turning him in, that ended up acting like the bloodhounds that found him and turned him into the authorities rather than acting like journalists, right? They acted like henchmen. And it's like,
Yeah.
how are we supposed to now trust these outlets when they won't show us the documents? I mean, it's a good point. They won't show us the documents. They just said, well, this is what's in them. And so WikiLeaks was trying to say, well, no, you should be able to see for yourself. You could see the document for yourself, read it, and then decide. So at this time, was there any writing, and has there ever been any writing on WikiLeaks by by journalists writing? Did they write any like synopsis of the documents, and then you could read the documents on your own, or was it just strictly a site to publish the documents?
WikiLeaks would put out what we could call press releases, where they would say, these are the documents we are making available. I don't know who wrote them. There's a tendency to say that everything that comes from WikiLeaks is Julian Assange, but it is worth noting that they did have a small staff that worked for WikiLeaks, and people cycled in and out. But we don't always know who those people are, and I think that's intentional. Julian Assange made the choice of being the lightning rod for attention from
Hmm.
governments all over the world. And then these other people could work behind the scenes and hopefully remain unknown, because if they were known, it would likely mean that they were being targeted for some kind of prosecution or some kind of attack that was an infringement on their ability to work for WikiLeaks. So, no, as far as your question, they didn't do their own news articles with the documents typically. And that was what was remarkable about the releases from Chelsea Manning that are going to be at the core of our conversation, because finally they were forming media partnerships which allowed that information to be pushed out. But previously, what existed on the WikiLeaks website was this list that kind of looked like a directory
Hmm.
of articles. It almost kind of looked like, if you go back to the 1990s internet, like when you could see behind
Right.
the, like you could see the map
Yeah.
of a website. That's what
Hmm.
it was like on WikiLeaks.
Okay. So, and this is an important part. I'm glad you explained all of that. It's important because that is also part of the crux of why some people do not believe Julian Assange is a journalist, right? It's this thinking that, well, but what was he right? He's not like a journalist. Like when we think of journalism, we think of somebody who goes and investigates a story and writes a piece on it, or does a visual piece on it, something along those lines, right? And that's when a person thinks they're defending journalism, that's what they think they're defending. And in this situation, it's different. It's publishing, not as much journalism as much as it is publishing. And
Yeah.
people have a difficult time. Some people seem to have a difficult time understanding the difference between the two, or how they're totally related.
Although I'm getting a little bit ahead in the conversation, but it's relevant to the issue of Julian Assange being considered a journalist. We need to not only focus on the documents, but understand that Julian Assange managed to distinguish himself as somebody who was a known figure who could comment on surveillance, comment on wars, and would be invited by publications or news programs to provide commentary that sometimes didn't even have to do with WikiLeaks disclosures. So, like, the progressive show Democracy Now! Would have him on to comment on NSA surveillance, the disclosures from Edward Snowden, even though WikiLeaks really didn't have anything to do
Right.
with that. And then Washington Post would publish op-eds from him, even as their editorial board was attacking WikiLeaks and saying WikiLeaks was not journalism. He did have an internet interview program called The World Tomorrow that was licensed at one point. He was a journalist. So even if you don't think that because he isn't contextualizing the documents, that doesn't make him a journalist, which I think that's a debate, but I don't really feel like wasting our time having that
Mhm.
discussion. Um, he was a figure who checks all the boxes of being a journalist. And so I always point that out to people when they say that he isn't a journalist,
Yeah.
because you need to think of him as more than just the publisher of WikiLeaks documents, because there was a lot that he was doing as the editor in chief.
Mhm. Okay, so now that we've kind of established WikiLeaks a bit, before we go on, I want to establish Julian Assange as a person. And this is another part of his history that people bring up, those who are against Julian Assange or who are trying to prosecute him, bring up his hacking past, because that then goes into what they actually are trying to, the crime they think that he committed and they're trying to go after him for it, right, is hacking. So tell us about his past as a hacker.
So, admittedly, this is a blind spot in my reporting, mostly because I don't believe it has much to do with the indictment. So, in defense of being ignorant about what Julian Assange did before WikiLeaks, I'll say that none of that is in the indictment. And also, when you listen to the US government or the lawyers that represent them in court, they never mention this. Now, I'm familiar with it. I'm actually only familiar with it because there is a movie that is available called Underground that features Julian Assange, that shows what he went through when he was, I think he was still an adolescent, and he was in legal trouble for his hacking, and then managed to move on from it and rebuild his life, and no longer be dependent on that as a way of getting his name out there. He was no
Yeah.
longer known as a hacker. He was making the transformation more into a journalist who had this idea of forcing transparency from governments. But I suppose what I'd say to you that is remarkable is, even though he did have that past in Australia, it's not mentioned ever in this case, which is to say that while they could establish a pattern of behavior by pointing to it, I've never seen a prosecutor raise that, because I suppose it just has never been necessary for the prosecutors who are making their arguments.
Yeah, I don't right. I don't know if you could bring up typically in court cases, like, a person's past. It has to be, like, directly related, I think, even if it is seems to
Though
be to the
though
average
in the
person.
opening argument, as you were trying to convince a judge or a jury, you might point to
Right, to a
that.
past of
Yeah.
hacking. So, but what is also relevant to this is that it sounds to me like Julian Assange, with his history of hacking as in the past, thinks, wow, when you hack things, you kind of find out some sinister secrets, right? Like when you snoop through your partner's phone, you might find some things you don't want to find, something along those lines. And then thinking, well, okay, now creating a website where I guess hackers or anybody who can get their hands on these documents, however they get them, would be able to have a place to bring those documents, whistleblowers
Yes.
and I guess hackers, like however you want to frame a person, and they would have a place to actually bring those to be published. And the question then becomes, and this is like what they dealt with like the Pentagon Papers, right? It's the question of, if you receive classified information and you are a news outlet, are you able to then publish those papers even though they were illegally procured? Is that
Right.
that's an argument that has been had and has been held up over and over, that yes, if it's in the public's interest, that the public can know about documents that they're not supposed to know about, I suppose.
Yes. So in the United States, we don't have a law against the publication of classified information by newspapers. We don't have an Official Secrets Act. There is an Official Secrets Act in the United Kingdom, and what I tell people is there was a law that was considered, in fact, passed in Congress right before President Bill Clinton left office. That would have been I guess we called it an American Secrets Act, and uh, President Bill Clinton vetoed it. He recognized the issues, so did not go ahead and allow that to become law.
Mm,
And we have laws on the books. They mostly apply to government employees or contractors. So that's why this has been considered unprecedented and a dangerous case that threatens global press freedom, because we've gone from wasn't much that journalists could do about the government going after their media sources, but for the last 10, 20 years, the war waged by intelligence agencies and the US military and the Justice Department has been on people who had positions in government or were former officials, most
right.
of them lower level. If you're high ranking, you don't get in trouble. You get to leak, and you also have bargaining power. You can go into a room with your lawyers, meeting with prosecutors, and get a favorable sentencing deal. That's what David Petraeus did. But now we see this crossing of the Rubicon, so to speak, where they've decided the Justice Department will, first of all, make this determination that the person they are going after is not a journalist, which is wrong. I don't think you should do that. First Amendment protects freedom of the press, it protects the act. So anybody can perform journalism, and when you're performing
Mhm.
journalism, you should be protected.
Right.
They are making a decision to go after Julian Assange because they've decided he's not a journalist. And then they go forward with this interpretation of how they can apply the US Espionage Act from 1917 to somebody who isn't even a US citizen. So
Right.
this is where I tell people that this is the first application of it extraterritorially, and that we haven't seen somebody be brought, or they haven't tried to extradite someone to the United States to prosecute them for violating the Espionage Act. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, it's a law that punishes people in America for sedition, disloyalty, treason. It was part of a time under President Woodrow Wilson where they didn't want people challenging the push to join World War One. And so the idea that somehow Julian Assange, an Australian citizen, can be punished for being disloyal to the US and its, war on terrorism effort, or however you want to frame it, it makes it hard for your mind. Like, it's a rather absurd concept.
Hey guys, be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you like this segment. Now, you might be wondering, this seems like it's part of a bigger show. You're right, it is. The full show is at KimIversonShow.com. So, what you're watching is just a clip. And if you want to get the full experience, then you got to go to KimIversonShow.com. The show airs Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. That is where you can watch the full show. Here, you just get clips. So, click on the link down below, go to the full show, enjoy. Otherwise, I'll see you next time right here. And be sure, once again, like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.